The Origin of Capitalism, A Longer View, by Ellen Meiksins Wood. Chapter 7. The Origin of Capitalist Imperialism. All the major powers in 16th and 17th century Europe were deeply engaged in colonial ventures, conquest, plunder, and imperial oppression. Yet these ventures were associated with very different patterns of economic development, only one of which was capitalist. In fact, the one unambiguous case of capitalist development, England, was notoriously slow in embarking on overseas colonization, or even dominating trade routes, and the development of its distinctive social property relations was already well underway by the time it became a major contender in the colonial race. So the connection between capitalism and imperialism is far from simple and straightforward. Precapitalist imperialism. A common account of the connection between imperialism and capitalism, often associated with left versions of the commercialization model, suggests that European imperialist ventures in the New World, Africa, and Asia were decisive in the process of, quote, primitive accumulation leading to capitalism. Imperialism permitted, quote, proto-capitalists in Europe to accumulate the critical mass of wealth required to make the leap forward that distinguished the West from other societies that until then had been more advanced in commercial, technological, and cultural development. At the same time, imperialist exploitation drained the resources and halted the development of non-European economies. Some versions of this explanation emphasize the importance of wealth amassed from the New World, in the form of gold and silver. Here, the critical, or at least emblematic date is 1492, when Columbus sailed inadvertently to the Americas. Others stress the importance of the later slave trade and the wealth derived from slave plantations, in particular for the trade in sugar. Still others single out the importance of the British Empire in India in the process of industrialization. Yet we cannot get very far in explaining the rise of capitalism by invoking the contribution of imperialism to, quote, primitive accumulation, or indeed by attributing to it any decisive role in the origin of capitalism. Not only did British overseas colonization lag behind the imperialist ventures of its European rivals, its acquisition of colonial wealth also lagged behind its own domestic capitalist development. By contrast, Spain, the dominant early colonial power and the leader in primitive accumulation of the classical kind, which amassed huge wealth, especially from South American mines, and was well endowed with, quote, capital in the simple sense of wealth, did not develop in a capitalist direction. Instead, Spain expended its massive colonial wealth in essentially feudal pursuits, especially war as a means of extra economic appropriation, and the construction of its Habsburg Empire in Europe. Having overextended and overtaxed its European empire, Spain went into a deep and long-term decline in the 17th and 18th centuries. Nor is it a simple matter to trace the causal connections between imperialism and the later developments of industrial capitalism. Marxist historians, for instance, have forcefully argued, against many arguments to the contrary, that the greatest crime of European empire, slavery, made a major contribution to the development of industrial capitalism. But here, too, we have to keep in mind that Britain was not alone in exploiting colonial slavery, and that elsewhere it had different effects. Other major European powers amassed great wealth from slavery and from the trade in sugar or in addictive goods like tobacco, which it has been argued fueled the trade in living human beings. But again, only in Britain was the wealth converted into industrial capital. So we are still left with the questions of why colonialism was associated with capitalism in one case and not another. Even those who are less interested in the origin of capitalism than in, quote, the Industrial Revolution, at a time when Britain really had become a preeminent imperial power, still have to explain why imperialism produced industrial capitalism in this case and not in others. It is very hard to avoid the conclusion that much, if not everything, depended on the social property relations at home in the imperial power itself. The particular conditions of systemic reproduction associated with those property relations, and the particular economic processes set in motion by them. The wealth amassed from colonial exploitation may have contributed substantially to further development, even if it was not a necessary precondition of the origin of capitalism. And once British capitalism, especially in its industrial form, was well established, it was able to impose capitalist imperatives on other economies with different social property relations. But no amount of colonial wealth would have had these effects without the imperatives generated by England's domestic property relations. If wealth from the colonies and the slave trade contributed to Britain's Industrial Revolution, it was because the British economy had already for a long time been structured by capitalist social property relations. By contrast, the truly enormous wealth accumulated by Spain and Portugal had no such effect because they were unambiguously non-capitalist economies. We can nevertheless identify a specifically capitalist form of imperialism, an imperialism that was more the result than the cause of capitalist development, and stands in contrast to other European forms. So let us first sketch out in very broad strokes the traditional pre-capitalist modes of imperialism and the way they were related to pre-capitalist social property relations at home in the imperial power. As we have seen, in pre-capitalist societies, appropriation, whether just to meet the material needs of society or to enhance the wealth of exploiters, took, so to speak, an absolute form. squeezing more out of direct producers rather than enhancing the productivity of labor. That is to say, as a general rule, pre-capitalist exploitation took place by, quote, extra economic means. By means of direct coercion, using military, political, and juridical powers to extract surpluses from direct producers, who typically remained in possession of the means of production. For that reason, too, relations of economic exploitation between classes were inseparable from non-economic relations, like the political relations between rulers and subjects. As for trade in these societies, it generally took the form of profit on alienation, buying cheap and selling dear, typically in separate markets, depending more on extra economic advantages of various kinds than on competitive production. Imperial expansion tended to follow the same logic. In some cases, it was largely an extension of coercive extra economic absolute appropriation, using military power to squeeze taxes and tribute out of subject territories, seizing more territory and resources, capturing, enslaving, and human beings. In other cases, it was conducted in the interest of non-capitalist commerce, where profits were derived from a carrying trade or from arbitrage among many separate markets. In cases like this, extra economic power might be used to secure trade routes, to impose monopolies, to gain exclusive rights to some precious commodity, and so on. Consider some of the typical patterns of European colonialism in the early modern period. Much of it has to do not with the settlement of colonies by people from the metropolis, but rather with gaining control of important trade routes or trading monopolies, or concerning the supply of some precious commodity. The Spanish Empire in the Americas, long the dominant European overseas empire, was less concerned even with commerce than with amassing bullion, extracting its wealth from the gold and silver mines of South America. So dependent did the Spanish economy become on this treasure that many observers from the beginning have argued that this preoccupation at the expense of commerce or agricultural production obstructed Spain's economic development. Where there was settlement, it tended to be for the purpose of enhancing trade, whether by establishing trading posts or by means of more wide-ranging territorial occupation. This kind of settlement might have little to do with production, or production might be for the purpose of provisioning the imperial power's merchant ships, as was the case with the Cape Colony established by the Dutch in southern Africa. Another example of pre-capitalist empire was the French colonization of Canada, where the principal economic objective was the fur trade. At the same time, a type of settler colony was established that seems to have had no immediate economic function. Now here's a word I'm not going to be able to pronounce. The seigneuries of New France constituted a subsistence economy, deliberately, if loosely, modeled on feudalism. Whatever purpose they may have served for the mother country, there was nothing here, either in the form of the settlements or in their purpose, that suggests any association with or predisposition to capitalist development. In other cases, where production was developed as an adjunct to trade, it tended to be based on pre-capitalist modes of extra-economic exploitation. In particular, the slave plantation, which several European powers favored, especially in pursuit of the massive trade in sugar, or the Spanish encomienda system, which amounted to the enslavement of indigenous peoples. Needless to say, capitalism did not put an end to these old imperial practices. On the contrary, capitalism created new reasons, new needs for pursuing some of them with even greater gusto, especially slavery. But the point is that it created a whole new logic of its own, new forms of appropriation and exploitation, with their own rules and requirements, and with that came a new imperial dynamic which affected even older forms of exploitation. Ireland, a new capitalist imperialism? The question mark is in the subtitle, so don't think I'm just... The new dynamics of a growing capitalist system produced a new form of colonization and a new kind of imperial drive, not just the age-old hunger for wealth and plunder, but more specifically, an outward expansion of the same capitalist imperatives that were driving the domestic market, the imperatives of competitive production and capital accumulation. Capitalist imperatives also created new motives and justifications for coercive dispossession. In pre-capitalist societies, land with labor attached to it, labor accessible to extra economic coercion, is generally more valuable than land by itself. Command over people is more immediately important than direct command over land. The Spanish Empire, for instance, in its pursuit of South American treasure, while it was unquestionably genocidal, made ample use of indigenous populations and their technical expertise. In capitalism, there is certainly a need for a labor force, but where competitive pressure to increase labor productivity is the driving imperative, there are certainly new reasons for concentrating property and entirely new reasons for dispossessing direct producers. In England, for instance, this had the added effect of creating a dispossessed surplus population of potential colonial settlers. And it is easy to see the difference between England and a peasant society like France, which never produced that kind of surplus population. England's relation with Ireland in the early modern period provided an insight into the dynamics of early capitalist imperialism. The social processes and ideological strategies associated with English agrarian capitalism were clearly manifest in Ireland, and the case of Ireland serves as an illuminating introduction to the emerging differences between capitalist imperialism and earlier forms. The processes we are concerned with took place from the Tudor colonization in the 16th century to Cromwell's conquest in the mid-17th century. There had already been a long history of English invasion and attempts to subdue the, quote, wild Irish, but a significant shift occurred in the late 16th century. Just at the time when the Tudor monarchy was consolidating the state in England, it also set out to impose that state's hegemony on Ireland. It is revealing to see the changes in its strategies of control. There had long been attempts to subdue Ireland by direct military means, and in the 16th century, there were various unsuccessful efforts to establish private military settlements as a defense against Irish rebellion. This was, in effect, a feudal model of imperial domination, with a kind of feudal lordship being used to dominate a dependent population by extra economic means. The Tudor monarchy sought to extend its rule over Ireland by force in a more systematic way, dominated by the state, but it also tried something new, which was to have far-reaching implications for the development of British imperialism. In the late 16th century, England's Irish strategy underwent something like an instant transition from feudalism to capitalism. The Tudor state decided to embark on a more aggressive process of colonization. But this time, the effort to exert extra economic control by a more effective military conquest was supplemented by an attempt to impose a new kind of economic hegemony, using military force to implant a new economic system, as well as a new political and legal order. In 1585, for instance, the English government announced a plan to recreate the conditions of southeast England in Munster by granting expropriated lands to settlers who had introduced English agriculture to the region. The object was not, of course, simply to introduce particular crops or techniques. The very conscious intention was to establish an English-style commercial order, a new kind of economy based on new social relations on the land, new relations between landlord and tenant, like the ones that were driving improvements in England. In other words, as an adjunct to direct means of military suppression, the new imperial project of the English state was to subdue the Irish by transforming their social property relations and introducing agrarian capitalism. Needless to say, the most effective means of achieving this transformation was still outright domination of the Irish or their complete eviction from their lands. But even if Ireland were not successfully absorbed into the English state, it could be integrated into England's economic orbit and subject to its economic coercions as an extension of the English economy. The English embarked on forcible expropriation of the Irish and resettlement of their lands by Englishmen and Scots, with or without Irish tenants. Military violence reached its brutal peak in the middle of the next century with Cromwell's conquest. Would continue to be an indispensable instrument of empire. I'm going to reread that sentence. For some reason, I feel like I read it wrong. Military violence, reaching its brutal peak in the middle of the next century with Cromwell's conquest, would continue to be an indispensable instrument of empire. But the effect of the new strategy was to compel Irish chieftains themselves to adapt to the transplanted economy and to adopt English landlord-tenant relations, to become improving and expropriating landlords, and even to encourage the settlement of Englishmen and Scots as tenants on their land. No doubt this was partly the age-old effect of subject elites emulating and ingratiating themselves with imperial overlords, but there were surely also some purely economic compulsions at work, the imperatives of economic competition. The consequence of this attempt to transform the dominant property relations Sorry, I got confused. No doubt this is partly the age-old effect of subject elites emulating and ingratiating themselves with imperial overlords. But there were surely also some purely economic compulsions at work, the imperatives of economic competition. The consequences of this attempt to transform the dominant property relations and to enrich the imperial masters by this means was to improve the vast numbers who were dispossessed and pushed to the margins of the new system. The intention was not to turn Ireland into a commercial competitor, even for the benefit of colonial settlers. It was rather to make Ireland an economic dependency of England exploitable in the interest of the metropolitan power. As soon as Irish commercial expansion became a competitive threat, as it showed signs of doing in the 17th century, the English imposed restrictions that thwarted development, in a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the imperial history of capitalism. This history exemplifies one of the founding contradictions of capitalism: the need to impose its imperatives as universally as possible, and the need to limit the damaging consequences that this universalization has for capital itself. The Irish experience became, quite consciously, a model of empire for the English. The, quote, aggressive colonialism pioneered here by the Tudor state, quote, was the chief legacy of the late Elizabethan Ireland to English colonization in the New World, end quote. I don't know who quoted that, whose quote that is. Footnotes are in the back. I'm telling you. If you ever publish a book, do not do that. Do not make it so you have to flip pages to see footnotes and who is being quoted. It's terrible design. Really fucks up my flow. So, if you ever publish a book, don't fuck up my flow. Even some of the same personnel found their way to the Americas and beyond. Englishmen schooled in the Irish colonial venture transported their experience to the American colonies, not to mention the Scots, whose role in Ireland was only the beginning of a long tradition of service to the British Empire. For the British themselves, expropriation from very early on often meant migration to the colonies. Even when some Irish Catholic planters learned the imperial lesson all too well, settling in the West Indies, for instance, and helping to bring indentured servants from Ireland to boost the labor force. Sorry, I'm fucking getting so messed up here. Even some Irish Catholic planters learned the imperial lesson all too well, settling in the West Indies, for instance, and helping to bring indentured servants from Ireland to boost the labor force. Now I'm going to slow down. Deep breaths. Especially after the massive evictions of the Cromwellian conquest, the Irish may have constituted the largest single white migration to the West Indies in the 17th century. The Irish model, then, represented a pattern of imperial settlement different from other European empires, a form of colonial domination that replaced existing property relations with new ones driven by market imperatives. The social transformation typically took the form of violent expropriation and, especially in the New World, even genocide. But even in the absence of direct colonial rule, or at least in the absence of successful direct domination, it might now be possible to impose a new economic order with coercions of its own, perhaps the world's first structural adjustment programs. Later developments in the British Empire, especially in Asia and Africa, would produce a variety of imperial forms, some quite different from the early colonial settlements, where, especially in India, the imperial state confronted a densely populated and economically advanced power with deeply rooted and complex political arrangements. Methods and ideologies had to be found that would enable and justify the domination of one powerful state by another. Needless to say, military force and conquest always remained central to the imperial project, with or without settler colonies. While white settler colonies did persist in various places, the model pioneered in Ireland was eclipsed by other forms. Still, there are ways in which that model presaged the future form of capitalist imperialism, and some of its principles have survived to this day. Dispossession and extinction of traditional property rights, of one kind or another, have of course been a continuing practice, but most of all, capitalism has developed to its utmost limit the practice of economic compulsion, as distinct from direct political and military coercion, not only as a mode of class rule, but also as a form of imperial domination. In today's globalized economy, old forms of military subjugation and direct rule have been largely replaced by the imposition of economic compulsions, the imperatives of the capitalist market manipulated in the interest of a few imperial powers, and one in particular. To be sure, behind the new global economic order is the most powerful military force the world has ever seen, and the constant threat of military coercion by the United States, with or without the cover of, quote, international cooperation, is a necessary bulwark of, quote, globalization. But today, the old role of colonial settlers as a means of transporting economic compulsions has been taken over by local nation-states, which act as transmission belts for capitalist imperatives and enforce, quote, the laws of the market. Empire and the ideology of improvement. In the 17th century, the new logic of capitalism was becoming more transparent. As we have seen, was finding increasingly explicit ideological and theoretical expression. Sorry, I'm going to repeat that whole thing. I'm sorry for whoever's listening to this. I keep fucking up. My mind keeps going astray when I'm trying to read. And it's embarrassing. I feel like I'm just going to say something like so stupid, like some real creepy Freudian slip in the middle of reading. Empire and the ideology of improvement. In the 17th century, the new logic of capitalism was becoming more transparent and, as we have seen, was finding increasingly explicit ideological and theoretical expression. In particular, as increasing labor productivity became the overriding imperative, that imperative made its way into new conceptions of property rights. Making land productive, that is, improving it, was becoming the basis of property rights. And more particularly, the failure to improve could mean forfeiting the right of property. The principle of improvement as the basis of property rights was working its way into the law, into legal disputes about property, especially over enclosure. It also appeared in political theory, notably in the work of John Locke, who, as we saw in Chapter 5, developed a whole theory of property on that principle. When we unpack his famous idea that individuals acquire a right to property by mixing their labor with it, we find at its heart the notion of improvement, the idea of productivity for profit, the idea that the natural right of property derives from its productive use. People acquire a right to property by giving it value, which Locke makes very clear means exchange value. This had vast implications, not only for the domestic practice of enclosure, but also for the dispossession of indigenous peoples in colonial territories. And on that score, Locke was quite explicit. Writing about America and its indigenous peoples, Locke, as we saw, explains that an acre of land in unimproved America may be as naturally fertile as an acre in England, but it is not worth 1/1000th of the English acre if we calculate, quote, all the profit an Indian received from it were it valued and sold here, end quote. In other words, the Indian has added no exchange value to the land, which effectively means he has failed to mix his labor with it. The measure of labor is not effort but profitability. We can then easily deduce that the Indian has failed to establish his right to the land, which becomes fair game to more, quote, industrious and, quote, rational colonists. Unimproved land is waste, and a man who appropriates it to himself in order to improve it has, by increasing the land's value, given something to humanity and not taken it away. Historians of political thought have pointed out that while Locke was not the first theorist to argue that unoccupied and unused land could be claimed as property by those able and willing to render it fruitful, he introduced an important theoretical innovation by justifying colonial appropriation of unused land without the consent of any local sovereign, providing settlers with a systematic argument that justified their actions on the basis of natural law, without any reference to civil authority. But Locke's innovation goes much further than this. even if land is occupied by indigenous peoples, and even if they make use of the land themselves, their land is still open to legitimate colonial expropriation. His notion that property derives from the creation of value, from, quote, improvement that enhances exchange value, implies not only that mere occupancy is not enough to establish property rights, or even that hunting and gathering cannot establish the right of property while agriculture can, but also that insufficiently productive and profitable agriculture, by the standards of English agrarian capitalism, effectively constitutes waste. This redefinition of occupancy and waste means that land in America is open to colonization because an acre of land in, quote, unimproved America has not produced exchange value comparable to that of improved land in England. Locke wrote this in the late 17th century at a time when agrarian capitalism had already put down deep roots in English society, especially in those parts of the South that he knew best, and when England's colonialism in England and North America already had a well-documented history. Knowing something about that history, domestic and colonial, it is instructive to work backwards from Locke's theory of property. Locke himself had a keen interest not only in the domestic economy, but also in the colonies, drafting a constitution for the Carolinas and investing in the slave trade. This theory of property encompasses the project of, quote, improvement, both in England and in its colonies, both the domestic experience of agrarian capitalism and the project of colonial settlement, both enclosure at home and expropriation of indigenous land in the colonies, both the interest of Locke's mentor, Lord Shaftesbury, in the productive exploitation of his own estates at home, and his involvement in the American colonies. Keeping all this in mind, we can now look back at the arguments of John Winthrop, first governor of Massachusetts, who had roots in England's Irish settlements and had intended to make his life in Ireland. Justifying the intended plantation of New England in 1629, justifying the intended plantation of New England in 1629, he makes an argument about the Indians that foreshadows Locke on property in general. The Indians have not been using their lands according to God's will, he insists. Quote, for the natives in New England, they enclose no land, neither have they any settled habitation, nor any tame cattle to improve the land by. End quote. John Winthrop, first governor of Massachusetts. So as long as the colonists leave them enough for their own obviously limited use, the rest can lawfully be taken from them. But even this is not the first example of an argumentation like Locke's in the justification of colonial expropriation. There is, for instance, a fascinating document written by one of the principal figures of English imperialism in Ireland in the early 17th century, a letter from the lawyer Sir John Davies to the Earl of Salisbury concerning the state of Ireland in 1610. The purpose of the letter is to lay out the legal arguments that were being made by English lawyers, like Sir John Davies himself, in justification of the Ulster plantation. the eviction of the Irish, and the replacement by Englishmen and Scots, with some redistribution among the Irish themselves. First, there is an argument showing that the king has supreme rights over the land not only by English common law, but also by Irish customary law, which of course has been set aside in any case as no law at all, but just, quote, lewd and, quote, unreasonable custom. Sir John Davies then goes on to show that the king is not only entitled by law, but also bound in conscience to seize Irish land. Quote, His Majesty is bound in conscience to use all lawful and just courses to reduce his people from barbarism to civility, the neglect whereof heretofore hath been laid as an important... Jesus Christ, I'm going to read this whole... Sir John Davies then goes on to show that the king is not only entitled by law, but also bound in conscience to seize Irish land. Quote, His Majesty is bound in conscience to use all lawful and just courses to reduce his people from barbarism to civility, the neglect whereof heretofore hath been laid as an imputation upon the crown of England. Now, civility cannot possibly be planted among them by this mixed plantation of some of the natives and settling of their possessions in a course of common law. For if themselves were suffered to possess the whole country, as their septs have done for many hundred of years past, they would never, to the end of the world, build houses, make townships or villages, or manure, or improve the land as it ought to be. Therefore it stands, neither with Christian policy, nor with conscience, to suffer so good and fruitful a country to lie waste like a wilderness, when his Majesty may lawfully dispose it to such persons as will make a civil plantation thereupon. Again, his Majesty may take this course in conscience, because it tendeth to the good of the inhabitants many ways. For half their land doth now lie waste, by reason whereof that which is habited is not improved to half the value. But when the undertakers, the settlers, are planted among them, and that land shall be fully stocked and manured, 500 acres will be of better value than 3,000 acres are now. End quote. Sir John Davies, Earl of Salisbury, was a lawyer. Charming creature. 80 years before John Locke's Second Treatise of Government was published, Sir John Davies is making essentially the same argument for the colonial settlement of Ireland that Locke would make for the dispossession of American Indians, and the same kind of argument that was made for enclosure in England and the extinction of customary rights of English commoners. Here, too, the core of the argument is, quote, improvement. The increase in exchange value derived from improved productivity. Here, too, the issue is not simply occupancy or even fruitful use, but relative value. The similarities down to the last detail are truly uncanny. The talk about waste the numerical calculation of the value of improved as against unimproved land, the suggestion that the improving settlers are not taking anything away, but adding something. The Irish case is significant, not just because it was the earliest, but also because Ireland was, in the 17th century, a favorite test case or laboratory for English social theory and even natural science. For instance, scientists interested in improving English agriculture thought of Ireland as a perfect location for pilot projects. Some of the most innovative agricultural techniques were tested in Ireland. Ireland was also regarded as the ideal setting for what they called, in the Baconian manner, natural histories of various practices and institutions. Political and economic thinkers, such as William Petty, thought of Ireland in those terms. For instance, in 1671-2, he wrote a self-consciously Baconian natural history, an essay of political anatomy, on the political anatomy of Ireland, printed in 1691. He tells us that he chose Ireland as his exemplary, quote, political animal, following the model of students of medicine who, quote, practice their inquiries upon cheap and common animals and such whose actions they are best acquainted with, and where there is the least confusion and perplexure of parts, end quote. William Petty. He has known this particular political animal, he says, since it was an embryo. What he means is that he has known Ireland since Cromwell's conquest. When William Petty served as his surveyor general in the conquered territory, and in that capacity played a leading role in the forcible restructuring of Irish society. In fact, excuse me, I don't know why I came in so energetic there. Need to kill the energy. Chill. I should wear sunglasses inside. It'll set the mood. From enclosure to empire? Question mark. In fact, the English colonial experience in Ireland and in the Americas was a major factor in what might be called the self-consciousness of English capitalism itself, making the logic of English domestic property relations more transparent. The understanding of English agrarian capitalism was refracted through that imperial experience. Petty, for instance, who is often called the founder of classical political economy, elaborated the theory of value that is supposed to be his seminal contribution to that field in response to the very concrete practical requirements of his position as Cromwell's surveyor general, while he was conducting his land survey for the purpose of distributing land among the conquered soldiers. Conquering soldiers, Jesus Christ. Pray for me. These ideological developments bring into sharp relief the specific logic of capitalism in the evolution of imperialism. We have seen that from the earliest years of agrarian capitalism in England, its economic logic became not just the driving force of the domestic economy, but also an instrument of imperial domination beyond the boundaries of England. We can trace the connections very neatly by following the affiliations between the ideology of early capitalism and the ideology of empire. We need not make assumptions about direct influences to see the thread connecting John Locke to John Winthrop and both to John Davies. There can be little doubt that the English colonial experience, first in Ireland and then in the New World, was a major inspiration in English theories of property and value, the basic tools for understanding their own domestic capitalism, which is nowhere more obvious than in the work of Petty and Locke. Yet, we must push things even further, really to see the connections between agrarian capitalism and the new form of imperialism. None of Locke's or Petty's theoretical debts to England's colonial project makes sense unless we also acknowledge that this project had its own practical and theoretical roots in the English domestic economy, in English agrarian capitalism. The English, again, were not alone in justifying imperial expansion on the grounds that unoccupied land could be claimed by those who would render it fruitful. But they did, as we have seen, introduce important innovations in that argument. It seems to have been in England that it was first suggested, notably by Thomas More, as early as 1516 in his Utopia, that the seizure of vacant land could be justified even without the consent of the local government, though it was Locke who gave this principle a systematic theorization. More significantly, the English, particularly John Locke, took the argument a major step further by justifying the seizure of land that was indeed occupied, and perhaps even cultivated, on the grounds that the occupants had failed to use the land productively and profitably enough by the standards of English commercial agriculture. For both John Davies and John Locke, in their various ways, the critical issue is not simply occupancy, but relative value. The Irish farmer, or the Indian hunter-gatherer, indeed the Indian cultivator, may occupy and work the land, but he has failed to add sufficient exchange value to it by means of improvement. In effect, the English had redefined vacancy by reducing waste. Oh, excuse me. Jesus Christ. See, this is why I don't like when I get blurred out, because I read words wrong, and I'm like, God, how many words have I fucked up that I didn't even notice that I fucked up, and totally gave a misleading reading of these texts that I am reading. The Irish farmer, or the Indian hunter-gatherer, indeed the Indian cultivator, may occupy and work the land, but he has failed to add sufficient exchange value to it by means of improvement. In effect, the English had redefined vacancy by redefining waste. In the context in which they took that fateful step in imperialist ideology is again their own domestic economy. It is difficult to identify the exact moment in legal history when arguments such as those used to justify colonial expropriation were first made to justify dispossession or enclosure in England itself. But they were already being made in the early 17th century. And even before that, debates on enclosure certainly raised questions about productivity and profit. There was certainly a growing, quote, improvement literature in the 17th century, with roots in the 16th, about how to make agriculture more productive, and certainly arguments from improvement later figure in legal disputes over enclosure and other property disputes. There is also no doubt that these early domestic concerns about the productivity and profitability of agriculture, or the benefits of enclosure in enhancing improvement, lie at the heart of Locke's political theory in the late 1670s and 1680s. Long before these formal and systematic theorizations, we can easily detect the agrarian relations, practices, and discourses that generated these later ideologies. The project of bringing the southeast of England to Ireland obviously presupposes the English model on which it was based, and it is hard to imagine the mentality of Sir John Davies without presupposing the mentality of an improving English landlord. It is also impossible to imagine William Petty's theory of value and its elaboration as an instrument of empire in Ireland without presupposing the notions of value already firmly implanted in the minds of the improving landlord preoccupied with the profitability of his own estate in England. Before Petty, and before Sir John Davies, we have the English landlord's surveyor, as we saw in Chapter 5, working out his own rudimentary theory of value. It is not difficult to see the connection between the domestic concerns of these land surveys with Petty's ambitious colonial survey half a century later. Similarly, it is surely no accident that while Englishmen from John Davies to William Petty were devising schemes for reproducing English agrarian capitalism in Ireland, the French embarked on a scheme to reproduce seigneurialism in New France, just as French landlords and their surveyors would seek to revive their feudal rights at home. The ideological implications of the English justification of expropriation and colonization on the grounds of improvement were enormous. This kind of imperialism, in which the claims of the imperial power rested on capitalist principles of productive use of property for private profit, was justified on the same basis as individual claims to property. Even in the Irish plantations, for example, even if the Irish plantations, for example, started as a project of the royal state, the agents of that project were private, quote, undertakers, and the colonial project was based on the private actions of industrious settlers, not just the public actions of states and legally constituted political authorities. The imperial legitimacy of the colonial power was rooted in the productive activities of its subjects, its improving settlers. It was becoming difficult to detach the state's jurisdiction over Ireland, or England's imperial claims, from the rights of individual proprietors and their capacity to generate exchange value. Although the British Empire would be distinctive in the degree to which it relied on white settler colonies, colonization for the private benefit of colonizers was obviously nothing new. Nor was the imperialist of the early modern English, Jesus Christ. Although the British Empire would be distinctive in the degree to which it relied on white settler colonies, colonization for the private benefit of colonizers was obviously nothing new. Nor was the imperialism of the early modern English the first to depend not only on a powerful imperial state, but on a network of private proprietors. After all, the Roman Empire, whose concept of colonia the British self-consciously revived, was governed not so much by a massive state apparatus in Rome as by a relatively simple state at home in alliance with local aristocracies throughout the empire who extracted every material benefit they could from Rome's imperial hegemony. It is true that the English case was distinguished by a distinctive form of appropriation with a logic of its own. But what was even more distinctive about this form of imperial domination, or rather, what this distinctive form of appropriation implied, was a system with coercions of its own, economic imperatives, reinforcing and eventually capable of replacing the extra economic coercion of military conquest and direct political domination. These economic coercions are unique to capitalism. The ideological implications go even further. The arguments for colonial expropriation was not just the improving settlers, the argument for colonial expropriation was not just that improving settlers had the right to expropriate and displace people who were not suitably productive, nor was it even just that colonizers could, indeed should, expropriate those who might be productive but not producing for commercial profit. The point was that, just as Locke's improvers and enclosers were giving added value to the people they displaced, effectively creating value, and therefore giving something to the community rather than taking it away, the colonizer, in expropriating local populations, was not robbing subject peoples, but adding to the common good. These colonizers now found their justification in economic rather than extra-economic moral or religious principles. Or more precisely, the economic principles took on a moral and religious meaning. Just as human beings engaged in improvement had assumed God's role as creators of value, their project had become the new religion. Well, I'm sorry if that was terrible. Thank you for listening. That was Chapter 7 of The Origin of Capitalism by Ellen Meiksins Wood, entitled The Origin of Capitalist Imperialism. Thank you for listening.